I'm a night guard at a haunted prison. The rules are terrifying. The first shift. I took the job because I was desperate. Bills were piling up, my landlord was breathing down my neck, and my options were running thin. When I saw the posting for a night guard position at Blackridge Penitentiary, I didn't hesitate. The pay was suspiciously high for a security job, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. Blackridge was decommissioned years ago, a relic of a bygone era. It loomed on the outskirts of town like a forgotten beast, its stone walls cracked with age. The state had kept the facility intact for historical purposes, but there were always whispers about why it really closed. Stories of unexplained deaths, inmates disappearing from locked cells, and guards who went mad patrolling the halls. I didn't believe in ghosts, but even if I did, fear wouldn't pay my rent. When I arrived for my first shift, my supervisor, Officer Grayson, was waiting by the entrance. He was an older man, weathered and stiff, like he'd been carved from the very stone of the prison. Without a smile, he handed me a worn-out handbook. "These are the rules," he said, his voice grave. "Follow them exactly. No exceptions." I flipped through the pages, expecting standard procedures, but the rules were strange. Number 1, never leave your post between 3 a.m. and 3:33 a.m., no matter what you hear. Number 2, if you see a prisoner in cell block D, do not engage. That block has been empty for decades. Number 3, if you hear someone whisper your name, do not answer. It is not your coworker. Number 4, at exactly 2:17 a.m., check all the security monitors. If anyone is standing still and staring at a camera, turn the feed off immediately. Number 5, before the shift ends, write your name in the ledger at the main desk. If your name is not recorded, you will not leave this place. I laughed nervously. This some kind of initiation prank. Grayson's expression didn't change. You'll see soon enough. The first few hours, the job started out boring. I patrolled the empty halls, my flashlight beam bouncing off rusted bars and crumbling walls. The cells were long abandoned, but it still felt like I was being watched. Maybe it was the countless prisoners who had lived and died here. Maybe some trace of them remained, woven into the very structure of Blackridge. By 2 a.m., I had almost convinced myself the eerie atmosphere was all in my head. The occasional clang of metal, the creak of the old pipes, just the sounds of a decaying building. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., I remembered the 4th rule. I hurried back to the security office, my heart pounding as I pulled up the monitors. The screens flickered with grainy black and white footage of empty halls. Except one wasn't empty. In the D block corridor, a man stood motionless, his back to the camera. I leaned closer. He was wearing an old inmate uniform, the numbers on his chest too smudged to read. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing against me like unseen hands. Then, slowly, the man began to turn. My fingers fumbled for the keyboard, and just as his face came into view, I cut the feed. The 3 a.m. rule. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the whispers started. Soft at first, like a breeze slipping through the bars. Then clearer, more insistent. "James." I froze. It was my name. "James, help me." The voice was coming from the hall, just outside the security room. It sounded so real, so close. But I knew the rule. I couldn't answer. The whispering grew frantic, desperate. My name was repeated over and over, warping into a chorus of voices, rising in volume until it became a deafening, pleading shriek. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands clamped over my ears. The air turned ice cold, my breath fogging up in front of me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. I had followed the rule. I was safe. Something in cell block D. By the time I gathered the courage to leave the security room, the halls were silent again. I gripped my flashlight, forcing my legs to move. Then I saw it. A single cell door in block D, standing open. I had checked earlier. Every door had been locked. A shadow shifted inside. My breath hitched. I wasn't supposed to engage, but something was watching me. I could feel it. Then, ever so slowly, a hand curled around the edge of the doorframe. It was pale, unnaturally long fingers, curling like a spider's legs. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then the whisper came again, this time from the open cell. "James." I turned and bolted. The ledger. My shift was almost over. I needed to sign the ledger. My hands shook as I grabbed the pen at the main desk. The book was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. I flipped to the last recorded entry. My stomach turned. The most recent name before mine was from 20 years ago. And below it, scribbled in shaky, uneven handwriting, "Don't forget where you'll be next." I scrawled my name down and slammed the book shut. As I left Blackridge that morning, the first rays of sunlight barely breaking over the horizon, I saw Officer Grayson waiting by the gate. "Made it through your first shift," he said, nodding approvingly. "You follow the rules." I swallow, my throat dry. "What happens if you don't?" Grayson's face darkened. "You don't clock out. The forgotten ones." I didn't sleep the next day. Even with the morning sun pouring through my window, the memories of my first shift at Blackridge Penitentiary clung to me like a fever dream. The whispers, the thing in cell block D, the chilling message in the ledger, it all felt unreal. And yet, when night fell, I found myself driving back toward the prison. I told myself it was just a job, a well-paying job that I couldn't afford to lose. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had to know more. The second shift begins. Officer Grayson was waiting at the gate again. He looked me over, his sharp eyes scanning my face like he was checking for cracks. "You came back," he said simply. "Yeah." He gave a knowing nod. "Then you know the rules already. Stick to them." I hesitated. That ledger, those names, how many people? Grayson cut me off with a hard look. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to." I swallowed my curiosity and stepped inside. Unfinished business. The prison felt different tonight. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. As I made my rounds, my footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty halls, like something unseen was walking just behind me. I checked the security feeds at 2:17 a.m. My stomach clenched. In cell block D, the same figure from last night stood motionless on the screen. But this time, he wasn't facing away. He was staring directly into camera. His face was gaunt, sunken eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His mouth was moving, but no sound came through the speakers. Then his head snapped violently toward the door, toward where I was standing. I slammed the monitor off. A second later, a loud clang echoed from down the hall. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, my pulse hammering. The cell door was open, the same one from last night. I wasn't supposed to engage. That was the rule. But my legs moved on their own, drawn by something I didn't understand. I stepped closer. The darkness inside the cell was impenetrable, but as I shone my light inside, I saw something scratched into the wall. "Help US." A breath of cold air brushed against my neck. I spun around, nothing there. But the hallway felt different, like I wasn't alone. The forgotten prisoners. At exactly 3 a.m., the whispers started again. "James." I clenched my jaw and stared at the ground, refusing to acknowledge them. "James, you can help us. You see us now, don't you?" I squeezed my eyes shut. "You saw the name in the ledger." My breath caught in my throat. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Who are you?" A mistake. The air around me shifted. The walls groaned. The shadows stretched unnaturally. Then, all at once, the silence shattered. A deafening slam echoed through the prison. The sound of dozens, no, hundreds, of cell doors slamming open at once. The security lights flickered. My flashlight sputtered. And then, footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps, coming from all directions. My chest tightened as figures emerged from the cells. Gaunt, hollow-eyed prisoners, their faces twisted with something between sorrow and rage. Their prison uniforms were rotted, stained with time and something darker. They weren't alive, and they were staring at me. The 3:33 a.m. escape. I bolted. I sprinted through the corridors, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air grew colder with every step, my vision blurring at the edges. The whispers turned to wails. I could feel them reaching for me, hands that never made contact but sent icy dread seeping into my bones. The security room. I had to get to the security room. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. My fingers fumbled for the radio. "Grayson," I panted. Something's happening. The cells. Static. Then a voice. Not Grayson's. "You should not have spoken." The lights died, and in the pitch black, I heard it. Breathing. Right behind me. The ledger's warning. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was paralyzed with primal fear. Then, ever so slowly, the breathing moved away. The lights flickered back on. The monitors came to life again, their screens filled with static. Except for one. On the feed from cell block D, a single sentence had been scratched into the prison floor, the words impossibly deep, like they had been carved with something far stronger than human hands. Don't forget, US. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling. My shift was almost over. I had one last thing to do. I grabbed the pen at the main desk, flipping to the ledger. My breath hitched. My name was gone. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Hand shaking, I wrote it down again. The ink barely dried before the front gates creaked open. The shift was over. As I staggered outside, Grayson was waiting. He said nothing, just watched as I gasped for air, my hands still trembling. Finally, I managed to ask, what happens if I hadn't written my name? Grayson exhaled, his expression unreadable. You wouldn't have been able to leave. I looked back at the prison. The empty windows stared back like hollow eyes. A thought chilled me deeper than anything else I'd experienced that night. If my name had been erased from the ledger, had someone else taken my place? The prisoner who never left. I didn't want to go back. I told myself I'd quit. That no paycheck was worth another night in Blackridge. But when the sun set, I found myself driving down the same desolate road, the prison looming in the distance like a hungry mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something I didn't want to name. Either way, I was here again, and something was waiting for me. A missing name. Officer Grayson met me at the entrance like before, but tonight, his face was different. There was something almost cautious in his eyes. You all right, kid? He asked. I nodded, though we both knew it was a lie. He studied me for a moment, then let out a slow breath. Check the ledger before your shift starts. That was new. I hesitated, but did as he said. The old book sat on the desk where I'd left it, its pages brittle with age. I flipped to the latest entry. My heart nearly stopped. My name was gone. Again. Not just mine. Every entry from the last 2 decades had vanished, as if they had never existed. The last recorded name was from 30 years ago. A prisoner's name. The unfinished sentence. I didn't have time to process it. The shift had started, and I had a job to do. The halls were deathly quiet, more than usual. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, but unmistakably there. I checked the security monitors at 2:17 a.m., my hands clenched in a fist. The man in cell block D was back. Same hollow-eyed stare, same inmate uniform. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was writing something. His skeletal fingers dragged across the filthy prison floor, leaving deep scratches. The letters formed one by one, slow and deliberate. He still. Then, without warning, the screen cut to static. A loud clang echoed from down the hall. Cell block D. I already knew what I would find. Face to face with the past. The cell door was open, the same one as before. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The darkness inside the cell was suffocating, as if light itself refused to exist in that space. Then from inside a whisper, low, raspy, waiting. I lifted my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark and landed on him, the prisoner from the security feed. But this time, he wasn't some distant figure on screen. He was right in front of me. His face was pale, gaunt, like he had been starving for years. His sunken eyes were locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, his lips parted. You came back. My breath hitched. My brain screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed planted. He took a slow step forward, and the air turned ice cold. You see me now, he whispered. That means you can help me. I finally found my voice. Who are you? He tilted his head. You already know. My mind flashed to the ledger. The missing names. The last recorded prisoner. No, it couldn't be. I swallowed hard. You're one of the inmates. A ghost of a smile flickered across his cracked lips. I never left. The walls around us groaned. The air grew thick, pressing in on me. Then suddenly, all the lights went out. The 3 a.m. rule, broken. I couldn't see. The darkness swallowed everything, stretching endlessly in every direction. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then footsteps. Not just the prisoners. Dozens of them. The sound of shuffling feet, dragging movements coming from everywhere. And the whispers. Not one voice. Not two. Hundreds. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't answer. Don't move. But then, a hand gripped my wrist. It was ice cold, its fingers unnaturally long, digging into my skin. A voice rasped inches from my ear. You broke the rule. Panic surged through me. I yanked my arm free and ran blindly through the pitch black, slamming into walls, tripping over unseen obstacles. Somewhere in the distance, the prison alarm blared, a distorted, agonized wail. Then, a single voice rose above the others. Write your name. The ledger's final warning. I knew what I had to do. I sprinted back toward the main desk, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The darkness clawed at me, unseen hands reaching, pulling. I slammed into the desk, fumbling blindly for the ledger. My fingers found the pen. I flipped open the book and saw the warning scrawled across the page. If you don't write it now, you never will. Something moved behind me. I didn't look. I scrawled my name down with shaking hands. The second the ink hit the paper, everything stopped. The whispers died, the cold lifted, and the lights flickered back on. I gasped for air, my vision swimming. Then I turned. The prisoner was gone. The hall was empty. The truth about Blackridge. As I staggered outside, dawn barely breaking, Grayson was waiting. This time, he didn't say anything. I held up my arm. Dark, finger-shaped bruises wrapped around my wrist. Proof that something had touched me. I met his gaze. What is this place? Grayson exhaled. A prison. His voice was distant, unreadable, but not just for the living. I shuddered. That prisoner, the one in cell block D. He's been here for decades, hasn't he? Grayson didn't answer, but his silence told me enough. Then he looked at the ledger. Your name's still there? I nodded. Good, he said, his expression grim. Make sure it stays that way. I turned back to Blackridge. The prison loomed, silent, watching. And deep inside, I could still hear the whisper. Waiting. The man in the warden's office. I wanted to quit. I should have quit. But the moment I walked out of Blackridge after my third shift, I knew quitting wasn't an option anymore. Because when I checked my wrist, the one the prisoner had grabbed, his handprint was still there. The bruises hadn't faded. If anything, they had darkened. And worse. When I tried to wipe my name from the ledger the next day, the ink didn't smear. It wouldn't erase. It was like Blackridge had claimed me, and I wasn't sure if it would ever let me go. An unexpected rule change. On my fourth night, something was different. Grayson wasn't waiting for me at the gate. The usual chill of the prison air was heavier tonight, like the place itself was holding its breath. I stepped inside, my fingers brushing the ledger before my shift officially started. My name was still there, but there was something new. A fresh line had been added beneath the existing rules. Rule number 6. The warden's office must remain locked. If you hear someone inside, do not enter. A lump formed in my throat. I'd never seen a rule change before, and if Blackridge had suddenly decided to add a new one, it meant something was inside that office. A door that shouldn't be open. I made my rounds cautiously. The prison was eerily quiet tonight. No whispers. No distant footsteps. Just silence. Too much silence. By the time I reached cell block D, I realized something disturbing. The prisoner, the one who had appeared every night on the security feed, was gone. His cell was empty. I stared at the blank monitor in the security room, expecting him to flicker into existence. But the screen remained still. He wasn't in the block anymore. He was somewhere else in the prison. And then, I heard it. A sharp, distinct click. The sound of a door unlocking. The warden's office. The man at the desk. I froze. The office was at the end of the East Wing, a place I had never been. The warden's quarters had been sealed for decades, untouched since Blackridge had shut down. But now, the door stood wide open. A warm, flickering glow spilled out from inside. Candlelight. My heart pounded. Do not enter. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it. But something compelled me forward. I stepped inside. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold. It was like stepping into another time, one where Blackridge was still alive, still functioning. The room was immaculate. The old mahogany desk gleamed under the candlelight. The bookshelves were free of dust, and a faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air. And behind the desk sat a man. His back was to me, broad shoulders hunched over something on the desk. He was dressed in an old warden's uniform, perfectly pressed, untouched by time. But his presence was wrong. It felt like he wasn't really there. Like the space he occupied wasn't meant to hold something like him. Slowly, his head turned. Not his body, just his head. And when his eyes met mine, I finally understood why the rule had been added. The warden's sin. His face was rotting. His skin, stretched too thin over bone, was peeling in places, revealing raw muscle and blackened veins beneath. His lips had withered away entirely, leaving his teeth exposed in a grotesque, permanent grin. But his eyes were alive. Dark, sunken pits filled with something ancient and hungry. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice like dead leaves scraping against concrete. I took a step back. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs locked in place. He lifted a skeletal hand and pointed to the desk, to the ledger. Not the one I had been signing each night. This one was different. Older, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. My name wasn't in this book, but another name was. The last prisoner recorded in Blackridge. The one who had been following me since my first shift. Jonah Kraus. A bargain in blood. "Do you know what he did?" the warden asked, his grin never fading. I swallowed. "Ooh." The warden tapped the name in the book with one long, decayed finger. "Jonah Kraus. He was the last man to die in this prison," the warden whispered. "They hung him right here, in this very room. He was a killer. A monster." I didn't speak. The air in the office grew heavier, pressing against my chest. "He doesn't deserve to leave," the warden continued. "But he's trying." The candlelight flickered, and suddenly I understood. Jonah Kraus's name had been erased from my ledger. His cell had been empty. He wasn't just a ghost haunting Blackridge. He was trying to escape it. And if the warden was right, he wanted me to take his place. A choice in the dark. "Write it," the warden hissed. I looked down. A pen lay next to the old ledger. The ink was dark, thick. It smelled like blood. "If you write his name," the warden said, "he stays. You go free." The walls seemed to pulse around me. Jonah had begged me for help, told me I could see him now. Was he a victim? A prisoner of a place even darker than death itself? Or was he a monster trying to escape judgment? The pen trembled in my hand. And then, the lights died. Darkness swallowed the room, suffocating, absolute. A voice whispered in my ear. Not his. Not the warden's. "Jonas, you don't know the truth." A skeletal hand closed over mine, guiding the pen toward the page. I had to make a choice. Write the name, or refuse. I took a breath, and made my decision. The last name in the book. The pen hovered over the ledger. The ink smelled like blood. The warden's rotting grin stretched wider, his empty gaze locked onto me. "Write his name, and you'll be free." Jonah Kraus's voice whispered in my ear. "You don't know the truth." The walls around me seemed to shift, the air thick with something unseen but suffocating. I knew I had only seconds to decide. Write the name, or refuse. My fingers trembled. Then I made my choice. Breaking the contract. I dropped the pen. The instant it hit the desk, the warden's grin disappeared. His expression contorted, the rotten skin pulling tight over his skull. His skeletal fingers twitched, as if resisting an unseen force. "You." His voice splintered, deepening into something inhuman. "I'm not writing it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The room groaned around me. The candlelight flickered wildly, shadows dancing across the walls. Then, everything went black. Not the kind of darkness you get when a light goes out. This was complete, utter nothingness. And in the void, I felt it. Something shifting, something ancient stirring from its slumber. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the empty space. Laughter, but not from the warden. From him. Jonah Kraus. The truth of Blackridge. The darkness shattered. I was no longer in the warden's office. I stood in a different time. The walls of Blackridge weren't abandoned and decayed anymore. The prison was alive, filled with the echo of boots marching on cold stone, the distant clatter of metal trays in the mess hall. And in the center of it all, Jonah Kraus. He was alive. Not the gaunt, hollow-eyed figure from the security feed. Not the whispering specter in the dark. A man, flesh and blood. And he wasn't the monster the warden had made him out to be. He wasn't the prisoner. He was the guard. I watched as the past played out before me, the scene unraveling like an old film reel. Jonah stood in front of the cell, his face twisted in barely contained rage. Inside was another man, One I recognized immediately. The warden. Only back then, he wasn't a specter of decay. He was alive, and he was afraid. You think you can hide what you did? Jonah's voice was sharp, seething. The warden trembled, his eyes darting toward the ledger in Jonah's hands. You don't understand. I understand enough, Jonah snapped. You made a deal, didn't you? The warden didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth slammed into me like a freight train. Blackridge wasn't just haunted. It was cursed. The warden had been desperate, afraid of something, of someone. And in that desperation, he made a bargain. A deal that required a name to take his place. And Jonah Kraus had been the last name written in the book. They had framed him, made him the prisoner, had him hanged for crimes he never committed. And in doing so, they bound his soul to Blackridge forever. A final choice. The vision shattered. I was back in the warden's office, back in the decaying present. The warden still stood before me, but something was different now. His face was melting, crumbling like burnt paper, his grin stretching too wide, his blackened teeth grinding together. You should have written his name, he rasped, his voice warping, distorting. You could have left. Jonah's whisper came again. Write the right name. I looked down at the ledger. A single blank line remained beneath Jonah's name. Waiting. I picked up the pen, and in one swift motion, I wrote the name of the real monster. The warden screamed. The end of Blackridge. The prison shook. The walls trembled. The floor cracked beneath my feet, and a horrific wail echoed through the building. The warden collapsed, his body withering, curling in on itself like something being dragged away. The moment his name was written, his power snapped. He wasn't the jailer anymore. He was the prisoner. I stumbled back as his form dissolved into shadows, the very fabric of him being pulled into the ledger's pages. And then, everything went silent. The oppressive weight that had haunted Blackridge for decades was gone. The prison was just a ruin now. A hollow, empty shell. And for the first time since I started, I could breathe. Jonah stood at the far end of the room, his form fading. He didn't speak. He just gave me a nod. And then, he was gone. The last page. When I checked the ledger one last time, I saw something chilling. Every name, the ones that had disappeared, the ones erased by the prison's curse, were back. Except mine. The prison had let me go. And Blackridge, it would never claim another soul again. I left that night and never returned. But sometimes when I pass that empty stretch of road where Blackridge once stood, I swear, I hear a voice in the wind. Jonah's voice. Thank you. The end.